There are moments etched into our collective memory, moments that shape the skies and the very fabric of our lives. September 11th, 2001, forever stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of our world as aircraft tragically pierced the heart of the Twin Towers. But long before that fateful day, decades earlier, another chilling tragedy unfolded amidst the towering skyline of New York City. A day when aircraft, like ghosts from the past, found itself on a collision course with destiny. In this podcast, we're going to take you back on a journey to the summer of 1945, when the Empire State Building, an icon of progress and aspiration, became a witness to a different kind of skybound drama. So hopefully you'll join us as we navigate the foggy skies that fateful day, retracing the flight of a B-25 Mitchell bomber, its crew's desperate struggle, and the lives forever changed within the steel and stone walls of the Empire State Building. Welcome to Destination Aviation. Well, welcome everyone back to this edition of Destination Aviation Podcast. I hope your week has been going well. Mine has here. I actually was able to have a conversation with someone who enjoyed the Alaska podcast, and they actually just visited Alaska, where they purchased a book that they showed me called Broken Wings, A Tragedy of Disasters in Alaska Civil Aviation, which featured our story, of course, with Speaker of the House Boggs and Representative Nick Blanche. So that was interesting to have a conversation with somebody about the podcast itself. They had some great stories, taking some aircraft, going around and seeing obviously some of the largest seaplane ports in the world. Basically everybody in Alaska has an airplane, right? It's the only way to get around. So they actually made their way from Anchorage. They made several different stops. They took a helicopter tour up to some of the ice glaciers, and then eventually making their way down through Canada all the way to Vancouver, hopping on a cruise ship. Sounded like a really nice trip. So if you haven't put Alaska on your bucket list yet, I would add it, especially if you're an aviation enthusiast or an outdoor enthusiast. It looked like quite the trip. A couple other things I wanted to touch on briefly. Sympathies go out to a couple accidents that happened over the last week from when we spoke on here last. 2 individuals died in a plane crash in North Carolina. Unfortunately, it sounds like the aircraft hit a power line, which caused not only a power outage within the area, but unfortunately took the lives of the occupants of the aircraft. The aircraft was a Skoda that departed from Hickory Regional Airport and was in flight when, unfortunately, not knowing what happened here, but probably trying to make an emergency landing of some kind and ran into the power line. So sympathies go out to the family members of those 2 individuals, and I'm sure they'll get to the bottom of what happened. And then the second incident that I wanted to talk about was a MiG-23 that crashed in Michigan. Actually, this aircraft was up in Oshkosh, and I know a few people that actually went and took a look at it, saw it during some of the demonstrations there, doing demonstrations in the Ypsilanti area for the Thunder over Michigan Air Show. Fortunately, both the pilot and the backseater were able to eject before the aircraft crashed into the earth. If you get online and look at any of the photos of this, there's a massive fireball and explosion. It's really unfortunate. Not too many Russian fighters out there flying around in the United States to see one of these go down, especially one that people love to see so much at these air shows. So fortunate that the pilot and the backseater were okay. Still nonetheless unfortunate to see one of those amazing aircraft go down, especially knowing that availability of those and getting replacements is probably unlikely, or at least very limited. But let's get into a little bit of this incident. I alluded to it in the last podcast that I had found information on this incident, and it really came back to, if you remember from our last podcast where we talked about UFOs over Mount Rainier, one of the incidents that occurred was when a B-25 crashed after departing investigating what ended up being a hoax in Washington. As I was looking into that accident, the articles I had found were referencing other B-25s that had crashed. Now, I had heard of this story before, but completely forgot about it, that there actually was an aircraft that crashed into the Empire State Building, being a B-25. As we know, and as we did in the introductory of this podcast, everybody knows, of course, 9/11 and the tragic events that unfolded in New York on that day. But little is known about an aircraft hitting the Empire State Building. Now, granted, we'll get into the story here, totally different circumstances than what was happening the day of 9/11. Nonetheless, interesting moment in time in history that for some reason has gone kind of onto the wayside and not really talked about. I've been to New York. I was actually there when the World Trade Centers were still standing. Had a chance to see David Letterman, which now sounds weird because I've referenced David Letterman in 2 back-to-back podcasts, but pure coincidence. But we actually went there, and we're going to go to the World Trade Centers, but did not end up getting there. But we did happen to see the David Letterman show, and we never made it down to the Empire State Building as well. I'm sure if you go into the Empire State Building, there probably is some sort of reference to this incident. As we get into it here, you'll see that it did affect, obviously, the building, at least during the time frame, not catastrophically what we saw at the World Trade Centers, but nonetheless did leave its mark for sure on the history of this place. Let's get a little bit into the background of this incident and talk about what we know and what we were able to find. So I think all of us know of the Empire State Building. We know the name. The history of the Empire State Building, I think, is where we wanted to start, just so we could talk a little bit about the structure, how it came to be. So, of course, the Empire State Building stands in New York City. The idea for the Empire State Building emerged during the Roaring '20s, a period of economic prosperity and architectural innovation. The concept was developed by John J. Raskob, a financier, and Alfred Smith, a former New York governor. The architects responsible for the design were William Lamb and his architectural firm, Shreve, Lamb and Hammond Associates. Construction of the building began in 1930. Construction of the Empire Building was a remarkable feat of engineering and efficiency. You've probably all seen the pictures of people eating lunch on skyscraper beams. A lot of those were taken at the Empire State Building construction site. Obviously, way before OSHA rules, as you're eating your lunch hundreds of feet above the New York skyline. At the peak, over 3,400 workers were employed to complete the skyscraper in just 410 days. It was constructed during the Great Depression, providing much-needed jobs to the labor force. The building rose at a rapid pace with an average of 4.5 stories added each week. Just a side note, interestingly, with the Great Depression era, myself, I'm big into state parks, national parks. So many of those areas were built up. Trails were built. Lodging cabins were built by the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. This was part of the New Deal program to help lift the United States out of Great Depression by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Not that the Empire State Building was part of this, but obviously that period and that time frame where there was a lot of government assistance to get people back up and running. Probably similar in some fashion, right, to what we have seen with COVID and COVID money. Not saying necessarily that there were programs created like CCC. There was a ton of money pumped out there, and you can see a ton of these infrastructure projects that are going on similar to like the Empire State Building, right? Infuse the economy with money. And in aviation, you see a lot of it at airports, whether that's building new terminals or reconfiguring runways or rehabbing runways, extending runways, all sorts of things are happening out there. Literally billions of dollars are being pumped into the system, which is why we also have seen the high inflationary period. But enough about economics, and back to the Empire State Building. The Empire State Building officially opened on April 11th of 1931. And was open to the public on May 1st of the same year. President Herbert Hoover remotely turned on the building's lights from Washington, D.C., illuminating the tower for the first time. Standing at 1,454 feet tall, and this included the antenna, the Empire State Building held the title of the world's tallest building until 1970. Now, I found that surprising that it held it till 1970. I would have thought something would have overtaken it before 1970. The building was built in Art Deco architectural style, characterized by its sleek lines, geometric shapes, and ornamental detailing. The building features a distinctive setback design, tapering as it rises to reduce the impact of wind on the structure. Obviously, as we all know, the Empire State Building was featured in King Kong, 1933, and Sleepless in Seattle in 1993. Ironically enough, I was actually in Washington State, and the home in Sleepless in Seattle where Tom Hanks lived. I've seen the movie probably, I don't even know if I've seen it all the way through. I've seen parts. I know enough about it, but everybody was going ape, which actually fits here. Ape King Kong, Empire State Building. Was going ape over the house itself and where Tom Hanks lived. And I guess the owners that had owned the house or still own the house, don't like all the attention. They don't like people coming and taking photos, etc. So I guess a lot of Tom Hanks fans out there. The building boasted a observation deck offering views of New York City, which of course made it a popular tourist destination. And as we've seen over the years, the Empire State Building has been lit up in various colors to commemorate certain holidays, events, and causes. In 1986, there was a massive renovation project aimed to modernize and restore the building's interior and exterior, and to this day has an ongoing legacy and remains an iconic fixture of New York's skyline. Its timeless design and enduring cultural significance continue to captivate visitors and inspire awe. But in 1945, when a B-25 bomber crashed in the Empire State Building, it resulted in a tragic accident and significant damage. On a fateful summer morning, July 28, 1945, an event unfolded that would forever etch its place in aviation history. The Empire State Building, a towering beacon of modernness and aspiration, was about to become the backdrop for a tragic collision between a legendary aircraft and the heart of New York City. The aircraft at the center of this narrative was the U.S. Army Air Force's B-25 Mitchell bomber, known by its moniker Old John Feather Merchant, a workhorse of the skies during World War II, was a twin-engine medium bomber that had played a crucial role in various combat missions. Now, I had to look this up because I was interested in what Old John Feather Merchant meant. Aircraft naming traditions by the military at the time often involved a mix of creativity, humor, and sometimes personal references. In the case of Old John Feather Merchant, the name likely reflects the crew's unique sense of identity, camaraderie, or even a private inside joke. While the exact inspiration behind the name may remain a mystery, it stands as a reminder of individuality and spirit that pilots and crew members often identify with on their aircraft. The cockpit of the B-25 that day was manned by a skilled and experienced crew, individuals who had dedicated their lives to mastering the art of flight. Lieutenant Colonel William Smith Jr., a seasoned aviator with a remarkable 2,200 hours of flying time. Now that may sound not like a ton comparative to some of the other references we made, but keeping in mind the date of this accident, he probably was just in the first steps of building his time up. Smith did have a good amount of combat missions and a deep understanding of the skies. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Stamps, who was the co-pilot, was also no strangers to the complexities of aviation. He too had tasted the dangers and the thrills of wartime missions in the European theater. Staff Sergeant Christopher Domitrovich was the navigator. Domitrovich brought his navigational experience to the cockpit, a role that was crucial in these days before advanced GPS systems. As we know now, as most of us fly, whether that's our own onboard GPS or we have our handy ForeFlight on our knee lap. I know it probably sounds like, oh, this guy must be good, sponsored by ForeFlight. I'm not. I'm just a big fan of it. From someone who carried around a briefcase full of sectionals and chart supplements, or airport facility directories, as they were known. It is amazing to me to have all of that on your knee with weather and aircraft tracking. It's just, as the kids would say in 1947, the bee's knees. So the departure point of the B-25 was the Bedford Army Field in Massachusetts. Bedford Army Field was known as the Bedford Army Air Base. This was a military airfield located in Bedford, Massachusetts during World War II. It played a significant role in the training and operations of the United States Army Forces. So the airfield's approximately 20 miles northwest of Boston. The airfield's location made it strategically important due to its proximity to the city of Boston and its access to the major transportation routes. The airfield was established in 1940 as part of the United States preparations for a potential involvement in World War II. Its primary purpose was to provide training facilities for air crews and support personnel. Bedford Army Airfield contributed to an extensive expansion of the United States Air Force's training infrastructure during the war. The airfield was not established long before this incident in 1945 at the Empire State Building. Most of the operations at the Bedford Army Airfield were training for bomber crews, including those who would later operate the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberators, which were vital to the European and Pacific theaters of World War II. With the end of World War II, the Bedford Army Airfield's importance diminished, and it was eventually closed. The airfield's legacy lives on in the history of military aviation as its contribution to the training of personnel who served in the war. Today, the area where the airfield once stood has seen various developments, and the site itself holds historical significance as a reputation of the nation's wartime efforts. While Bedford Army Field may no longer exist, its role in the training center Center and its place in the broader context of World War II history remains important aspects of the military heritage. I always find it interesting when we see airfields that were once operating closed. As you know, this doesn't happen too often in public use airports. It looks like for the first time a public use airport that's received federal financial assistance, or what is referred to as NIPIAS by the FAA, which is National Plan of Integrated Airport Systems, will potentially close, which is Santa Monica Airport, which now is currently planned to close in the year of 2028. Aviation has a huge target on it right now. People that complain about noise at airports are vocal. They are usually a minority, but they are a vocal minority. But I think it's important for all of us as aviators to talk about all the positive impacts that aviation have, from training the next generation. So many of these flight schools happen, especially at general aviation airports, programs within high school, STEM programs, air ambulances. I mean, the list is countless. And even, recreational flying or private flying is not a bad thing. Anybody that could fly private would. That's usually what I like to say. But anyways, I'm digressing here. It really just goes back to, I think it's interesting where airports used to exist, especially military airports, that we have seen a lot. We've seen a lot of military bases close over the years. Back to the podcast and why we're here, and Jeff can get off his soapbox. So after the aircraft departed from Bedford Army Airfield in Massachusetts, the B-25 was set for Newark Airport in New Jersey. A mere flight under normal circumstances. I actually knew the airport director at the Newark airport, or I think what they refer to them there as general managers. Newark for a long time fell under that category, as many airports, especially in the New York region, Newark, LaGuardia, those type of airports, where President Biden famously said that LaGuardia tends to vomit you out after you land. But I will say kudos to the team of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which manage all those airports, including Newark. They've put a lot of money into them, and if you go into Newark nowadays, it's completely different than what we remember. But they still have their problems to this day. United Airlines cut back on some of its flight schedule because of oversaturation of the Newark market, and they weren't able to keep their flight times. It is interesting, everybody's battling that. I know Scott Kirby with United, who's the CEO, is often talking about pilot shortages. Recently, if you listen to Scott Kirby's quarterly report, he was talking about currently have a lack of captains on their mainline aircraft, mostly due to the fact that there's a lot more flexibility in the first officer's role when it comes to work-personal life balance, and the average bump in pay to go from a first officer to a captain is $25,000, which most of the first officers are not seeing that as incentive enough to give up the flexibility that they currently have. So they are lacking captains. They're having issues maintaining their schedule. And even in the New York area, we saw Pete Buttigieg mention, and it's still ongoing out into the fall, that there are restrictions and limitations on aircraft flying into the New York area due to air traffic control staffing. Everybody is looking for staff. Once again, I diverge into another thought here, but now that we're going back into the story, we'll go back from Newark. Cool airport, awesome airport, has some claims to it. I definitely recommend checking out some of the history of New York, and maybe we'll add it into a podcast here at some point. So that day, the atmospheric conditions were far from ordinary. The skies were enshrouded in heavy fog, creating a veil that obscured the visibility and added an eerie layer to the cityscape below. Despite the adverse weather conditions, the crew, perhaps influenced by their combat-hardened determination, chose to proceed on. As the B-24 ventured deeper into the New York City area, the fog thickened, creating a navigational challenge that would prove insurmountable. The crew found themselves engulfed in a sea of whiteness, disoriented and struggling to maintain their bearings. Anybody that's been in conditions that's anywhere close to this, it is nerve-wracking to say the least. Even something as simple as going out over Lake Michigan sometimes in the right conditions and kind of seeing that you lose that perspective of the horizon from what's the sky, what's the water, and now same here, right? You're losing some of your perspective. You're trying to go back now and trust your instruments. It's kind of when people talk about, the Kennedy curse and how JFK Jr. left from Essex County Airport on Martha's Vineyard. He went out in conditions that experienced pilots had said that they wouldn't have been a part of. He had a broken leg, he was flying in fog, and he was a newly minted pilot. I would say that's not a curse and that's bad decision making, but That's me. But once again, now they're in fog. They're disoriented. They're struggling to maintain their bearings. Not to mention, you also have the world's tallest building standing at 1,454 feet in the air. Once again, that is completely obscured. At approximately 9:40 a.m., tragedy struck. In a moment that defied the imagination, the B-25 collided with the north side of the Empire State Building. The impact was catastrophic. It triggered a violent explosion that echoed through the surrounding streets. The building's interior was transformed into an inferno as aviation fuel ignited, casting a hellish glow across the urban landscape. In the wake of the collision, the city was thrust into chaos. Think of 9/11. Probably the majority of the people listening to this podcast, or maybe not, were alive to hear and see 9/11. Whether you were in New York City or you saw it on the news, it was chaotic. And from the research that I'm seeing here, this sounds just as chaotic in 1945. The B-25 had claimed its own, with 3 crew members meeting their end in a fiery maelstrom. Tragically, the Empire State Building also suffered its share of casualties, with 11 individuals who had been inside the iconic structure losing their lives. Now, this was 9:25 a.m., but it was a Saturday. I don't know exactly what was in the building at the time. Obviously, there was a lot of office space being used. We know today, for the most part, people don't even want to work Monday through Friday in an office space. But in 1945, there were people working in the building in New York City on a Saturday. The aftermath of the crash was marked by shock, grief, and an urgent search for answers. The investigation revealed a grim truth. The collision had been a result of combined forces of heavy fog, impaired visibility, and the crew's inability to navigate through the wall of the mist. So typically at this point, we would go into the NTSB report, but considering this is 1945, and the NTSB wasn't created until 1967, I thought it would be interesting to go through an article that was written on the accident itself. And it also has some descriptions in here from people that were either in the building or had something to do with the incident. So on Saturday, July 28th, 1945, a B-25 Mitchell bomber traveling at 200 miles per hour out of Massachusetts headed for the Newark airport, but it got lost in the dense fog and flew into floors 78 and 79 of the New York Empire State Building, at the time the world's tallest building. The accident caused the deaths of 14 people, which included 3 crewmen and 11 people in the building, and damage estimated at $1 million. Although the building's structural integrity was not compromised. On the day of the flight, Lieutenant Colonel William Smith Jr. was piloting the B-25 Mitchell bomber on a routine personal transport mission from the Bedford Army Airfield in Massachusetts to the Newark Metropolitan Airport in New Jersey. Smith had asked for clearance to land, but he was advised 0 visibility preceding the runway. At this time, he became disoriented by the fog and turned right instead of left after passing by the Chrysler Building. At 9:40 a.m., the aircraft crashed into the north side of the Empire State Building, making an 18 by 20 foot hole between the 78th and the 80th floors. One engine shot through the south side opposite of where the impact was. After it left the building, it flew as far as a block away, dropped 900 feet and landed on the roof of a nearby building, which caused a fire and destroyed a penthouse art studio. Another engine of the aircraft and part of the landing gear fell down the elevator shaft of the Empire State Building, which resulted in a fire that was extinguished within 40 minutes. Between 50 and 60 sightseers were on the 86th floor of the observation deck, so just 6 stories above where the impact happened. So we talked about the 3 pilots that were on the aircraft. What wasn't noted before was a machinist named Mate Albert Perna, and he was hitching a ride on the B-25. The rest included the 11 civilians that were occupied in the building. The machinist's body was not found until 2 days later, when search crews discovered that it had entered an elevator shaft and fallen to the bottom. The other 2 crewmen were burned beyond recognition. At the time, elevator operator Betty Lou Oliver was thrown from her elevator car on the 80th floor and suffered severe burns. First aid workers placed her on another elevator car and transported her to the ground floor, but the cable supporting the elevator had been damaged by the incident and it fell 75 stories, ending up in the basement. Oliver somehow miraculously survived the fall, on top of being burned. This was due to softening cushion air created by the falling elevator car within the elevator shaft. However, she did suffer a broken pelvis, back, and neck when rescuers found her amongst the rubble. This remains the world record for the longest longest survived elevator fall. That is unique to survive a near-death incident twice, but to fall 75 floors, and I had never heard of the vacuum creation of an elevator falling. That was interesting. Despite the damage and deaths, the building was open for business on many floors on the very next Monday, which is insane to think about. So it's less than 48 hours from when the accident happened. The crash spurred the passage of the long-pending Federal Tort Claims Act of 1946, as well as the insertion of radioactive provisions into law, allowing people to sue the government for the accident. I don't really understand the radioactive provisions, but obviously anybody that just went and saw Oppenheimer, everything was happening around this time period. Like I said, I have not read anywhere that the aircraft was carrying anything remotely radioactive, but people were able to sue, so. There are a lot of interesting pictures on here. I've took some of the more interesting ones and I will stick them on our Instagram account so people can take a look at those. So what we talked about, where there were some eyewitness reports and information, I thought this was interesting. I'll just read off a few of them here. Gloria Powell said, "I was at the file cabinet and all of a sudden the building felt like it was going to topple over. It threw me across the room and I landed against the wall. People were screaming and looking at each other. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know if it was a bomb or what was happening. It was very terrifying." Therese Willig recounted, "It was a very small universe at that point. You're stuck there in an island with fire all around us. A couple of the women had passed out from the smoke, and I had a handkerchief in my pocket. And so I used that to cover my nose and my mouth to protect me from the fumes, and somebody had opened a window. And I'm sitting there, and I thought about my rings, and I thought I won't be around to have them. Someone else might as well have them, so I took them off my fingers and threw them out the window. All of a sudden, there were firemen, and they were coming to our rescue, all dressed in their raincoats or whatever they wear. It was just wonderful. We climbed out through the broken glass. I was so grateful to be alive." In another quote, "In the other side of the office, all I could see was flames. Mr. Fountain was walking through the office when the plane hit the building, and he was on fire. I mean, his clothes were on fire. His head was on fire. 6 of us managed to get into this one office that seemed to be untouched by the fire and close the door before it engulfed us. There was no doubt that the other people must have been killed." Sounds like a very hectic time between the 70th and the 80th floor. I hope everybody enjoyed that little bit of history. Like I said, something that I had heard about. I don't know why it's something that kind of slips your mind. I mean, I guess now with 9/11 and people thinking of an incident that happened in New York. But even before that, but I knew of it, but it's one of those you forget it, and then it's kind of like, oh yeah, no, I remember hearing something about that. I'm glad that I was able to run across it again as we were researching the B-25 information for the last podcast. I actually was out this morning flying around. I went down to the Gary airport. There was a temporary flight restriction out today for surface to, I believe it was 16,000 feet off of Chicago. We have the Chicago Air and Water Show featuring the Thunderbirds. So we were able to punch through before the TFR was active. When we landed down at Gary, the controllers weren't really having any messing around besides kind of one in, one out. But, you know, the Globemaster sitting down there, the Thunderbirds F-16s were all parked out in front of the Gary Jet Center. So it was really cool to go down and see that. And we kind of buzzed around through the city and back north. But yeah, if I'm thinking maybe heading down to the city tomorrow to catch and view the Chicago Air and Water Show. We were actually invited down to the Gary Airport for an event that they're having for the air show, since they're really hosting all the acts there. But I don't know if I want to make it down that far tomorrow. We'll see. But we're already starting to work on notes for our next podcast. So I hope everybody's enjoying it. And until next time, we'll see you down the runway. Yeah, this is Jeff again. Just one quick thing here before we get to flight attendants' attention. We recorded most of this throughout last week, and I didn't get a chance to put it out last night, but we did make it down to Gary, so I will throw up one of the Thunderbird photos. We actually got to be out on the ramp with them, which was pretty cool. So we got to see them take off and head down to the Chicago skyline, so I'll throw that up. All right, now we'll see you down the runway.